The snow didn't fall softly that night. It slammed against the sidewalk like it was angry at the world. Lucas, once a man who built bridges, now wandered beneath them. His breath, visible in the cold air, was his only companion. Life had taken so much, yet hadn't stripped him of his empathy. That's what made this emotional story so deeply human from the very beginning. Huddled near the bus stop, he noticed her, shivering, heels sunk into icy slush, her tailored coat useless against the wind.
Hello, I'm going to tell you this incredible story. Remember that to receive new stories like this, you can subscribe to the channel, like the video, and activate the notification bell. Without further ado, let's get to the rest of the story.
People passed by without looking, as they always do. But Lucas didn't think twice. He slipped off his only coat, threadbare but warm, and draped it over her shoulders. It wasn't just fabric, it was the last thing he truly owned. Elena wasn't used to kindness without strings. She ran boardrooms, not crosswalks. But when Lucas looked at her, it wasn't pity, just quiet humanity. That coat didn't just warm her skin. It cracked something open inside her chest. This moment would linger, turning into one of those unexpectedly touching stories that stick with you forever. He walked away before she could even say thank you, disappearing into the blur of headlights and frost. She stood there, arms crossed over the coat, stunned, not by the gesture itself, but by how foreign it felt to receive real care with no agenda. That raw, unpolished kindness haunted her all the way home. And something told her this wasn't just a real story. It was the beginning of one. Later that night, curled up on a leather sofa too big for one person, Elena couldn't stop thinking about the man who gave up warmth for a stranger. Why would someone with nothing give so much? In her world, everything had a price. But this was different. It felt like someone had handed her a new lens to see through. The coat, still carrying the scent of cold streets and quiet sacrifice, rested on the back of a chair. She stared at it, unable to ignore the weight it now carried. Not just physically, but emotionally. It was a coat, yes, but it was also a question. One that whispered through her penthouse walls, calling her back to a forgotten version of herself. And as the city howled outside, and lights from distant windows flickered like stars too far to reach, something else stirred inside her. The kind of stirring that only happens when we brush against something real, unexpected, and quietly powerful. That night wasn't over. It had just begun, because inside that coat was a story still waiting to be told. Back in her glass-walled apartment, Elena tried to shake off the cold, but something deeper clung to her. As she hung up the coat, her hand brushed against a crumpled piece of paper in the pocket. Curious, she unfolded it. A child's drawing, two stick figures, a bright sun, and the words, "I love you, Dad Miguel." It hit her like a freight train, the kind of emotional story that doesn't ask permission before taking over. She stood frozen, the paper trembling slightly in her fingers. That simple sketch felt louder than a boardroom filled with voices. It pulled her backward, not just into Lucas's world, but into her own forgotten past. Suddenly, the echoes of her childhood came rushing back. Real story moments, one she had buried under layers of success and self-preservation, resurfaced, raw and undeniable. She remembered the cold, so sharp it burned her lungs, and the stranger who had wrapped a coat around her shoulders when she was just a scared girl in foster care. No name, no face, just warmth. A gesture that had once saved her spirit. And now, years later, the circle had returned, not as coincidence, but as quiet destiny. Elena sat down, clutching the drawing like it might vanish. She wasn't sure what a coat, a sketch, and a stranger were meant to teach her, but she felt the lesson thudding in her chest. Maybe it wasn't about charity at all. Maybe it was about remembering who we are when the noise fades. These touching stories don't just happen. They wait patiently, whispering when we're ready to hear them. That night, she didn't work late. She didn't scroll or sip wine or answer emails. She stared out at the skyline and asked herself questions no spreadsheet could answer. Who was Miguel? Why was his dad living on the streets? And why did she suddenly care so deeply? The real story wasn't just his anymore. It was becoming hers too. By dawn, Elena's mind was already spinning with possibilities. Not out of guilt, but out of something far more unsettling: connection. For the first time in years, her decisions weren't about performance metrics. They were about people, and one man, one child, and one forgotten memory were now leading her somewhere new. As the sun painted gold across her window panes, the drawing still sat beside her untouched. Not discarded, not forgotten. It was a reminder that in a world obsessed with speed and polish, sometimes it takes the rawest, smallest thing to awaken everything we thought was gone. And if that spark could ignite something in her, what else might it uncover? Elena wasn't one to chase shadows. But this wasn't business. This was personal, and something inside her wouldn't let go. With the help of her assistant and a few quiet favors, she tracked him down. Lucas was living in a beat-up car near the city's edge, barely shielded from the bitter wind. It was a moment straight from an emotional story. It felt more real than anything she'd ever signed her name to. When she knocked on his car window, Lucas didn't flinch. He just looked up, tired but calm, as if expecting nothing. She introduced herself, coat still in hand, heart pounding. Then came her offer. Not food, not shelter, but purpose. A job. Not just any job, either a role as human values advisor at her company. It sounded bizarre, but somehow, right? Lucas blinked, unsure if it was kindness or a trick. He wasn't used to being seen, much less valued. Why me? He asked quietly. Because people like you are what the world forgot it needed, she answered. And just like that, a real story was beginning to rewrite itself. Not with grand rescues, but with one honest opportunity. He walked into the office weeks later in donated slacks and a secondhand shirt, every eye watching. Not with judgment, but with confusion. Who was this man with weathered hands and soft eyes? Slowly, his presence shifted something. He didn't lecture. He listened. He told quiet stories during lunch. He made people feel again, one emotional story at a time. Meetings began to change. People stopped interrupting each other. Departments started collaborating instead of competing. There was a ripple effect, a reminder that business didn't have to kill empathy to succeed. And Lucas, unknowingly, was becoming the soul of a place that had forgotten it had one. Touching stories like his were making their way through the cracks. Elena watched it unfold, quietly stunned. Her decision hadn't been strategic, it had been intuitive. But as the office air grew warmer with connection, she realized something deeper. Lucas wasn't just healing the company. He was healing her too. The man who gave away his coat had unknowingly stitched her broken pieces back together. And through late-night talks and shared silences, they found themselves growing closer, not out of obligation, but understanding. Elena had built empires, but with Lucas, she was learning to build trust. No headlines, no press releases, just two people stumbling into something real. And what started as a job offer was slowly becoming something else entirely. With steady income and a place to go each morning, Lucas began to feel human again. Not like a project, not like a case, just a man with purpose. He moved into a modest home on the outskirts of town. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe, warm, his. And when Miguel stepped through the door for the first time, their embrace became an emotional story of its own. Miguel, wide-eyed and a little taller than before, looked at his father like he'd returned from war. In many ways, he had. Their dinners were simple. Pasta, stories, laughter, but they held more love than any five-star restaurant ever could. Lucas was rebuilding more than a home. He was rebuilding trust. And Elena slowly began joining them. At first, she was just a visitor, then a guest, then someone who stayed a little longer each time. She helped Miguel with homework, brought over groceries, asked about his dreams. The lines blurred between work and life, but in the best way. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was a real story written in tiny, meaningful moments. Lucas had no script for this kind of connection. He wasn't used to someone seeing past his worn-out past. But Elena never asked him to be anyone else. Her presence was gentle, never invasive, like the warmth of the coat he once gave away, only now returned in another form. Every touch, every glance, Every silence between them held something sacred. One evening, after a shared meal and a silly board game, Lucas reached into his pocket, not for a ring, but for courage. He didn't kneel, didn't make a speech. He simply looked at Elena and said, "You're already part of us. Will you stay for real?" There was no hesitation. Her yes wasn't loud. It was steady, full of truth. Another touching story quietly sealed. The next morning, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Lucas brewed coffee while Miguel packed his school bag, and Elena stood barefoot by the window, smiling. It was ordinary, which made it extraordinary. This wasn't just love, it was peace. A quiet kind that doesn't beg to be seen, but roots itself deeply. In that little house, with its creaky floors and second-hand furniture, something rare had taken root. A family, not bound by blood or tradition, but by choice. And if anyone asked how it all began, they might smile and say, well, there was this coat. But the truth is that was only the beginning of something much bigger. The wedding wasn't held in a grand hall or luxury venue. It took place in a humble community center, where lives were changed, not just celebrated. Elena had it built months earlier, naming it after the anonymous stranger who once gave her warmth as a child. Now, standing under soft lights and surrounded by laughter, that emotional story had come full circle. This wasn't about glamour. It was about legacy. The old coat, yes, the same one Lucas once gave away, was now framed near the entrance. Not polished, not perfect, just real. People stopped to look, many of them unaware of the full story, but somehow moved. It stood there like a quiet symbol that touching stories don't need to be loud to leave a mark. They just need to be honest. The guests weren't high-profile names or influencers. They were janitors, secretaries, volunteers, neighbors, and co-workers who'd felt Lucas's quiet kindness ripple through the halls. Children danced barefoot. Someone brought homemade cookies. Elena, in a simple dress, walked toward Lucas with Miguel by her side. No music, just heartbeats. It felt like something out of a forgotten fairy tale, one that finally found its ending. Their vows were whispers, not declarations. Promises not just to love, but to listen. Not just to stay, but to grow together. There wasn't a dry eye in the room, not because the moment was grand, but because it was so beautifully grounded. Real story moments like these don't ask for attention. They earn it through truth. After the ceremony, they didn't drive off in a limo. They stayed. They served food. They hugged strangers. Elena looked more herself than she ever had in boardrooms. Lucas, smiling gently, felt more powerful than any CEO. And Miguel, in his small suit, introduced his new mom to everyone like she was a superhero, which in a way she was. Now, the three of them live simply but fully. Their days are filled with breakfasts, school runs, and shared laughter, small things that once seemed out of reach. And yet, these are the moments that build a life. Elena still runs her company, yes. But now, her mission is driven by something far greater than profit. Kindness fuels every decision. The framed coat remains in the center, not as a reminder of hardship, but of what happens when love chooses to act. Their home is often filled with visitors, many seeking not help, but hope. And their story continues to touch others, quietly echoing across lives. Because, in the end, the smallest act of compassion can outlive us all. So tell me, when was the last time a small act of kindness changed the course of your day, or your entire life? Would you have done what Lucas did, giving away your last coat in the middle of a storm? Or have you ever been on the receiving end of an unexpected gesture that stayed with you forever? These emotional story moments often go unnoticed, but they shape who we are. If this real story touched your heart even just a little, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What part hit you the hardest? What would you have done in Elena's shoes? And hey, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss any of our future touching stories. There's so much more ahead, and trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next.